The envelope sat on Ethan's desk, unassuming yet ominous. It had been delivered to his office by a courier, no return address, no note, just his name scrawled in messy handwriting. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the seal, before tearing it open. Inside were photos. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The images were grainy, but the woman in them was unmistakable. Claire, his wife, the love of his life. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand resting on the arm of a man Ethan didn't recognize. In one photo, they were leaning close, their faces inches apart. In another, the man's hand was on her waist, pulling her closer. Ethan's stomach churned. He flipped through the photos again, his hands trembling. This couldn't be real. Claire wouldn't, she couldn't. They had the perfect life, or so he thought. Ethan and Claire were the couple everyone admired. He was a successful architect, known for his sleek, modern designs that dotted the city skyline. She was a philanthropist, the face of the Bright Horizons Foundation, a charity that helped underprivileged children. Together, they were power, grace, and generosity personified. But now, as Ethan stared at the photos, the cracks in their perfect life began to show. That evening, Ethan confronted Claire in their pristine, minimalist living room. The photos were spread out on the glass coffee table between them. "Explain this," he said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was racing. Claire glanced at the photos, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed. A light, dismissive laugh that made Ethan's blood boil. "Ethan, these are obviously fake," she said, rolling her eyes. "Someone's trying to mess with us. Probably one of your jealous colleagues or a rival charity. You know how people are." He stared at her, searching for any hint of guilt, any flicker of unease. But Claire was calm, her blue eyes steady, her posture relaxed. "You really think I'd do something like this?" she asked, her voice softening. "After everything we've built together?" Ethan wanted to believe her. He did believe her, at least part of him did. But the photos, they were too real, too detailed. "I don't know what to think," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. Claire sighed, standing up and walking over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and familiar. "You've been working too hard," she said gently. "You're stressed and someone's taking advantage of that. Let it go, Ethan. For us." For a moment he almost did. But as he looked into her eyes, something felt off. A flicker of something he couldn't quite place. That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, Claire sleeping soundly beside him. The photos were burned into his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was hiding something. By morning, he had made up his mind. If Claire wouldn't tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. Ethan picks up his phone and dials a number he found online. A private investigator. The screen fades to black as the call connects, leaving viewers wondering what secrets Ethan is about to uncover. Ethan sat in a dimly lit cafe, nursing a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. Across from him was Maggie, the private investigator he'd hired. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She slid a manila folder across the table. "You were right to be suspicious," Maggie said, her voice low. "Your wife's been busy." Ethan opened the folder, his stomach tightening as he scanned the documents. Bank statements, wire transfers, and offshore account details, all tied to Claire's charity, Bright Horizons Foundation. "She's been siphoning money," Maggie explained. "Small amounts at first, but over the past year, it's added up to millions. The money's being funneled into an account in the Cayman Islands." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Claire had always been so passionate about her charity work. She talked about it endlessly, the children they were helping, the lives they were changing. Had it all been a lie? "There's more," Maggie said, pulling out another photo. It was the man from the envelope, the one Claire had been so cozy with. "His name is Marcus DeLuca," Maggie continued. "He's a businessman, but not the kind you invite to dinner parties. He's got ties to organized crime, racketeering, money laundering, you name it." Ethan's mind raced. Claire and Marcus, the charity, the offshore account. It all clicked into place. forming a picture he didn't want to see. Her charity events, Ethan said slowly, are they? A front, Maggie confirmed. Perfect cover for moving dirty money. Donors write checks to the foundation, and Claire funnels it to Marcus. Clean money in, dirty money out. Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal on every level. His marriage, his trust, even his belief in the good Claire claimed to do. That night, Ethan sat alone in his home office, the evidence spread out in front of him. He stared at a photo of Claire and Marcus, taken at one of her charity galas. They were smiling, their heads close together like conspirators. He thought about all the times Claire had come home late, claiming she was working on the foundation, all the times she'd brushed off his concerns, made him feel like he was imagining things. And now this. Ethan's grief turned to anger, a cold, calculating rage that burned through him. Claire had played him for a fool. She'd used him, used their marriage, used her charity, all for her own gain. But she wasn't the only one who could play games. The next morning, Maggie called with an update. Claire's big charity gala is in 3 days, she said. It's the event of the year, celebrities, politicians, the whole 9 yards. If you're going to make a move, that's your stage. Ethan's lips curled into a grim smile. Perfect, he said. Ethan begins planning his revenge, gathering every piece of evidence he can. The screen fades to black as he stares at an invitation to Claire's gala. The words, an evening of hope and generosity, mocking him. Ethan's home office had become his war room. The walls were covered in timelines, bank records, and photos of Claire and Marcus. A laptop sat open on his desk, displaying a video file, a confession from Marcus himself. It had taken some convincing, and a not-so-subtle threat to expose Marcus to the authorities. But the man had finally cracked. In the video, Marcus admitted everything. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, and Claire's role in it all. She's the mastermind, Marcus said on the recording, his voice trembling. I just handled the logistics. She's the one who convinced donors to write those checks, who made sure the money went where it needed to go. Ethan replayed the video, his jaw tightening. Claire had always been persuasive, charming, magnetic. He'd fallen for it once, so had everyone else. But not anymore. Ethan's calm demeanor didn't go unnoticed. Over the next few days, Claire watched him closely, her sharp eyes missing nothing. You've been different lately, she said one evening, her tone light but probing. They were in the kitchen, Claire sipping a glass of wine while Ethan pretended to read the newspaper. Different how? He asked, not looking up. I don't know, she said, tilting her head. Quieter, more distant. Is something going on? Ethan forced a smile. Just work. You know how it is. Claire studied him for a moment, then set her glass down and walked over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and familiar. You know you can talk to me, right? She said softly. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. Ethan almost laughed. The audacity of her, to stand there and act like the caring wife, like she hadn't been lying to him for years. But he kept his face neutral, his voice steady. I know, he said. Thanks, Claire. She smiled, satisfied, and returned to her wine. But Ethan could feel her eyes on him for the rest of the night, watching, waiting. The day of the gala arrived. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. In his pocket was a USB drive, loaded with everything he needed to destroy Claire's perfect life. The bank records, the photos, Marcus's confession. He took a deep breath, his reflection staring back at him. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Ethan steps out of the car in front of the Grand Hotel where the gala is being held. The camera pans to the USB drive in his pocket as he walks through the doors, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses growing louder. The screen fades to black as he spots Claire across the room, radiant in a sparkling gown, completely unaware of what's coming. The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits, the air thick with the hum of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. Claire stood at the podium, radiant in a silver gown that caught the light with every movement. She was in her element, smiling warmly at the crowd as she began her speech. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "Your generosity is changing lives, giving hope to children who need it most. Together, we're building a brighter future." Ethan stood at the back of the room, his hand gripping the USB drive in his pocket. He watched her, his heart pounding, every word she spoke twisting the knife deeper. It was time. As Claire paused for applause, Ethan stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the room. Claire's smile faltered as she saw him approaching. "Ethan, what are you?" He didn't let her finish. He walked straight to the podium, gently but firmly taking the microphone from her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to the crowd, "thank you for coming tonight. But before we celebrate, there's something you need to see." He plugged the USB drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The screen behind him lit up, and the room collectively gasped as the first image appeared. A photo of Claire and Marcus, their faces close, their smiles intimate. "This is Marcus DeLuca," Ethan said, his voice steady, "a businessman with ties to organized crime. And this," he clicked to the next slide, showing bank statements and wire transfers, "is how my wife, Claire, has been using your donations to fund his illegal activities." The room erupted in murmurs, heads turning, voices rising. Claire's face went pale. "Ethan, stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like." But he wasn't done. He played the video of Marcus's confession, the man's voice filling the room as he detailed Claire's role in the money laundering scheme. "She's the mastermind," Marcus said on the screen. "She's the one who made it all happen." Claire's composure shattered. "Ethan, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he said coldly, turning back to the crowd. "This woman, this philanthropist asterisk, has been lying to all of you. She's been lying to me, and tonight, you all deserve to know the truth." The room was in chaos. Donors stood up, shouting questions. Reporters snapped photos, their cameras flashing. And then, as if on cue, 2 police officers entered the room, heading straight for Marcus, who had been sitting at a table near the front. "Marcus DeLuca," one officer said, "you're under arrest." Marcus didn't resist. He shot Claire a venomous look as they led him away, but she was too broken to notice. She sank to her knees on the stage, her sobs echoing through the room. Ethan looked down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment he felt a pang of guilt, but then he remembered the photos, the lies, the betrayal. "You did this to yourself," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Just as Ethan turned to leave, Claire's voice stopped him. "Ethan," she said, her voice raw and broken, "there's something else." He paused, glancing back at her. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. The room fell silent. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. "And it might not be yours," she added, her words slicing through him like a knife. The screen fades to black as Ethan stares at Claire, the weight of her words sinking in. The room is silent, the tension unbearable, leaving viewers desperate to know what happens next. The fallout from the gala was swift and merciless. Claire's charity, Bright Horizons Foundation, was shut down within days. Donors demanded their money back, and the media crucified her in headlines. Asterisk philanthropist or fraud? The fall of Claire Bennett. Asterisk. Ethan filed for divorce immediately. He moved out of their sprawling home and into a modest apartment, leaving behind the life they'd built together. The divorce proceedings were brutal, with Claire fighting for every penny. But Ethan didn't care about the money. He just wanted out. Claire was charged with money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy. Her trial became a media circus, with every sordid detail of her double life laid bare for the world to see. Marcus, in a bid for a lighter sentence, testified against her, painting her as the mastermind behind the entire operation. Ethan watched it all from a distance, his name barely mentioned in the press. But while Claire faced the consequences of her actions, Ethan found no peace. The revelation about Claire's pregnancy haunted him. He didn't know if the child was his or Marcus's, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The thought of Claire raising a child, his or not, filled him with a mix of anger and sorrow. He tried to move on, throwing himself into his work, but the weight of what he'd done lingered. He'd wanted justice, but what he'd delivered was vengeance. He destroyed Claire's life, humiliated her in front of everyone she knew, and exposed her darkest secrets. And for what? One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his apartment, he found himself staring at the USB drive that had started it all. He thought about the anonymous envelope, the photos, the person who had sent them, who had known about Claire's affair, who had wanted her exposed. He didn't have answers, and maybe he never would. The day of Claire's sentencing, Ethan stood outside the courthouse, watching as she was led away in handcuffs. She looked smaller somehow, her once radiant presence reduced to a shadow. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Ethan saw something in her gaze. Regret, maybe, or sorrow, but he felt nothing. As he turned to leave, a courier approached him, holding an envelope. "Ethan Bennett?" the courier asked. Ethan frowned. "Yes." The courier handed him the envelope and walked away. Ethan stared at it, his heart pounding. It was just like the first one. No return address, no note, just his name scrawled on the front. He opened it slowly, pulling out a single sheet of paper. On it was a message, typed in bold letters. "You think you've won, but the game isn't over." Beneath the message was a photo, a grainy surveillance image of Ethan himself, standing outside Marcus's office the night he'd confronted him. The screen fades to black as Ethan stares at the photo, his face a mix of shock and dread. The camera lingers on the envelope in his hands, leaving viewers wondering who sent it and what they want. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Was his revenge justified, or did he go too far? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because next week's story is even more explosive. A tale of sibling betrayal that will leave you questioning who the real villain is. See you then.